It is such a great joy to introduce my dear friend, Rabbi Shoshana Meira Friedman. I first met Shoshana when we were both studying in Israel. And I remember just being dazzled by her, by the way that she had been working for justice and combining her fierce advocacy with loving humor in her work as a medical clown. And in all of her wisdom, I remember being in classes and just being dazzled by her brilliant Torah and insights and thinking, I want to go wherever she is, which was Hebrew College, so I followed her here. And since then, I've been really overjoyed to get to watch her path evolve, because Shosh, your rabbinate has really followed an incredible trajectory of going where the world needs you and hearing God's call and following it. You are here today to speak about your journey as an incredibly powerful mother, seeing your child and his needs and becoming his fiercest advocate, and in the process becoming a rabbi to 16,000 followers on Instagram and social media who follow your posts and wisdom and Torah with deep gratitude for the ways that you are sharing and helping them to live lives of integrity and clarity and to speak their truth and get their needs met in a way that is deeply meaningful. You are an activist and continue to be an activist for protecting the planet, for climate change, for Torah and wisdom in a powerful, powerful way. You are a coach, you are creative, you are somebody who is always instructing and helping people to bring out their true art. And your work has been featured in so many places, from being a rabbi at Temple Sinai in Brookline to being a rabbi and teacher at Hebrew College to publishing in the New York Times and Tablet and WBUR's Cognoscenti. We are so grateful that you have taken the time to come share your Torah with us today and to teach us. And I want to just let you know we are going to be blessed with this incredibly fabulous talk now. And Rabbi Shoshana is also going to be doing a Q&A in the Benjamin Vestry during Kiddush. There'll be a separate food set up there, so head right away there to continue the conversation. Shosh, we're so grateful to you for sharing these powerful words. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Eliza, and to the Inclusion Committee for having me. This Shabbat, I'm going to share a personal story very different from the kinds of sermons I used to give when I worked in a congregation. And I want to be clear that it's my story. I assume that in this room there are autistic people and family members of autistic people who have their own experiences that will differ from mine. They are just as valid and just as important. We are a large and diverse community. 3 years ago, a neuropsychologist assessed our then 3-year-old son and called a few weeks later to tell us he was autistic. I was so relieved. Our son was verbally precocious, made intense eye contact, and was charismatic and social. He also loved being read a wall calendar or a Hebrew-English dictionary at night as a bedtime story, struggled with transitions and had unpredictable, frequent meltdowns, ran in circles around his preschool classroom downstairs here at Temple Emanuel, seeking sensory input he wasn't getting. Bedtimes could take 2 manic hours. Like our ancestors in this week's Parsha, my family was in an unknown wilderness, and we were ready to receive some Torah. Except the Torah that the neuropsychologist revealed to us didn't seem right. He was recommending behavioral interventions focused on changing what our son outwardly did, with no interest in understanding the reasons behind our child's struggles. As the doctor spoke, my heart raced, my body tensed. I thought about a white friend of mine in the process of adopting a Black girl. She had told me how she would be listening to the voices of Black adoptees of white parents, the people closest to her soon-to-be daughter's lived experience. And I realized that while I completely trusted conventional doctors about vaccines and disease, I could not rely on their Torah when it came to raising my autistic child. I needed an autistic Torah to guide my family's journey through this neurodivergent land. So that night, shoulders tense after another day of meltdowns and difficult transitions, I opened my laptop to a parenting forum where someone recommended a Facebook group led by autistic adults whose goal was simply educating the caregivers of autistic children in how to care for them well as autistics. My heart lifted. Why hadn't the doctor mentioned this? And so for the next month, I curled around my laptop every evening like a glowing fire in the Sinai desert, listening to stories and perspectives that widened the narrow views of autism I had been fed by the medical establishment and by media. I learned so much around this campfire. I learned that the underlying different information processing that defines autism does not lead to a few narrow autistic profiles of what you think of when you think, oh, the person's autistic. It actually leads to a diverse population of people who share categories of difference and disability in certain areas: social interaction, language and communication, repetition and routine, sensory processing, cognitive processing. Contrary to stereotypes, these differences and disabilities can be obvious to an outside observer, or they can be internalized, camouflaged, or intentionally or unconsciously masked. I learned around this campfire that most pediatricians, therapists, and highly trained psychologists are not trained in anything outside the stereotypical presentations of autism, despite decades of research that has expanded our understanding of this complex neurotype. I learned that autism is a dynamic disability, meaning that my son's support needs would very likely vary depending on the day, the month, his accumulated stress, the environment. I learned that there's a global autistic community that has been, for the last 2 decades, hard at work depathologizing autism. Not that it isn't hard to be autistic, not that it doesn't often co-occur with medical disorders, but that being autistic isn't something wrong or that needs fixing. It's a valid, though challenging, way of being human, a brain wiring that comes with different levels of disability depending on the person, but that always deserves accommodations because it's a disability, and respect. Most importantly, around this campfire, I learned that to be an ally to my autistic son, my goal should be to gift him with a positive autistic identity and explore autistic strategies that would help him regulate, communicate, and meet his basic needs and find delight in his life. I learned that to train him to act more neurotypically, especially at such a young age, would be training him to ignore the distress signals of his body, putting him at higher risk of abuse, depression, and addiction later in life. I also learned that having a white autistic child in the US would allow me to make very different cost-benefit decisions about how to care for him, and that many parents of Black and brown autistic children do opt to train their children to mask their autism from a young age, not because they are phobic of autism, but because they are desperately trying to prioritize their children's safety in a country with horrific rates of brutality towards visibly disabled Black and brown bodies. Applying the Torah that I learned around the campfire of my laptop, I began to take my child to a neurodivergent affirming occupational therapist. And that term, neurodivergent affirming, means we're not here to fix you or to make you more normal. We're here to explore and help you regulate in ways that work for your brain. So I took him to a neurodivergent affirming occupational therapist who helped us interpret our child's meltdowns and opposition as communication about his legitimate sensory and nervous system needs. We began a daily sensory diet of tight hugs, popsicles, jumping, and rhythmic singing. We encouraged his passions, his special interests, as they are often called in autistic culture. We encouraged his atypical modes of play. There were no sticker charts, no rewards, no timeouts, only a shared determination to discover what regulated our boy and what delighted him as an autistic person. As we trusted his body, he trusted his body. By 3.5, he could identify, I'm dysregulated, when he was. By 4, he could point to a picture of what would help him regulate, like jumping, rest, or water. At age 5, when, despite all of the accommodations we were offering, he still hit a stage of acute autistic burnout, we realized that he is PDA, a particular profile of autism in which a person is born with an overactive threat response that can impact their ability to meet basic needs. After 5 years of not realizing this was his neurology, he, like so many other children with the same kind of brain, the accumulated stress led him to a near constant fight, flight, or freeze state in which he could not leave the house for almost a year, except for occasionally. Recognizing that we were privileged to be able to do so with minimal financial strain, we pulled our panicking child from school. I huddled around the laptop campfire again, this time to receive the specific Torah of PDA. We began what's called low-demand parenting. We dropped limits on screen time. We turned his bedroom into a sensory gym. We got him on an effective medication. Our whole little family embraced his special interest of Minecraft because we knew from our studies in autistic culture that his special interest would be the key to his healing and well-being. In essence, throughout it all, we refused to put the burden of change on our small child and his vulnerable nervous system. Instead, we put that burden on changing our parenting, our expectations, and the environment in which he was learning. And this Torah was truly a tree of life. Just recently, 10 months after he went into acute burnout, my son is in the recovery stage, in a state of equilibrium. Only 6 years old, he is thriving, mastering skills that give him, an autistic person in America, a fantastic shot at a healthy, fulfilling, long life. These are skills I wish more adults in the world knew. He knows how to respect and communicate his limits. He knows how to learn and socialize, communicate, play, and self-regulate in ways that are native and healthy to his brain. He identifies easily as disabled, autistic, and proud. Growing up with autism so normalized in our home, he assumes many of his favorite YouTubers are autistic, the way my great-grandfather assumed all brilliant people must be Jews. I want to be clear, too, that my son needs a huge amount of one-on-one support from me and my husband. He will always be at high risk of burnout. This is how he is wired. The disability doesn't go away, nor does his needs for accommodations. But his struggles and his needs do not erase his pride in who and what he is, nor do they take away his ability to thrive within his limits. Pride, acceptance, challenge, and disability, and great joy can coexist. This is liberation. Now I want to tell you the other half of my story. What I didn't tell you just now is that when my son started occupational therapy, I loved every minute of it. As he played with his therapist, I rolled around on the gym mat, feeling the weight of my body press against the floor. I never wanted to leave when our time was up. At home, we collected fidget toys, more weighted blankets, a therapy swing. I realized I was using these things more than he was. Around this time, I began to work on some memoir writing, and as happens when I get interested in a project, I go all in. I was filled with urgent questions. Why had I always felt fundamentally different from other humans? How could I master whole bodies of knowledge with ease, get straight A's in school, but struggle to feed myself lunch? Where had my childhood belief come from that I had to save the world from environmental destruction? A belief so intense that it impacted my mental health for decades and impacted every career choice I had ever made. Finally, and let me tell you, I'm rather amused it took this long, I thought to ask myself if I might possibly be neurodivergent of some kind. My research led me to a list of traits common in autistic women without accompanying cognitive disability. I read this list with my mouth dropped open on December 8th, 2022. There I was on the screen. All-consuming passions, feeling alien among humans, a fantasy of saving the world to make sense of unusual gifts and a pervasive sense of difference. Overwhelming empathy, overwhelming sensory stimulation, social anxiety, digestive issues, preference for teacher over peers, info dumping, synesthesia. This list was not a diagnostic tool, but I had 160 out of 180 traits, very obviously. I confirmed what in the autistic community is called self-diagnosis through taking more online tests, through reading accounts from other late diagnosed autistic women with similar profiles. And about 8 months later, I got a coveted clinical diagnosis from a center that specializes in assessing adult autistic women. By the time I learned this fundamental truth about myself, I was 40 years old. I had spent my life being an award-winning straight-A student, educator, and rabbi. I had excelled, if I say so myself, in every job I had ever had. I took great pride in my creative projects and my passion to make a difference in the world. There was so much joy and love and friendship and family in my life. And also, throughout this, there was a hidden struggle that was hard to name. I struggled with chronic people-pleasing, with social exhaustion, with panic attacks, with burnouts, with an eating disorder, debilitating empathy for any suffering animal or person. I had near chronic jitters in my chest that I couldn't seem to calm. For 22 years, I had sought help: psychiatry, cognitive behavioral therapy, play-based therapy, trauma-informed therapy, couples therapy, internal family systems, so many great modalities of healing. And along the way, I had collected diagnoses like stones in my pocket: generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, panic disorder, complex PTSD. In therapy sessions, I was articulate and insightful, but it often felt like a performance. Not to mention, I was always jittery and exhausted after an hour of sitting face-to-face with the therapist. I never understood why therapy wasn't working better. Now I knew. I hadn't known I was autistic, and so I had kept exposing myself to the same level of social and sensory stimulation that was stressful, overwhelming, and ultimately burnout and panic-inducing to my nervous system. It was like I was jogging on an inflamed ankle, talking to a therapist about it, and then going out to jog again and wondering, why does the darn thing keep hurting? I had been receiving psychological interventions and diagnoses for what was, for me, and this is not always the predominant way the disability presents for autistics, but for me, autism is fundamentally a nervous system disability. Yet I had been receiving psychological interventions for it, and I was wandering around the wilderness, following the wrong Torah. Over the past year, I have shed shame and confusion about myself like an old skin. I have grown a beautiful, proud autistic identity. The autistic strategies I learned from other autistics and from my son's occupational therapy have done more for my well-being in 1 year than 22 years of therapy ever did, combined. They include a positive autistic identity and acceptance of my disability, connecting to autistic communities, organizing my life around my special interests, letting myself hyper-focus, go into a monotroping state without any shame or confusion as to why it's happening, access to soothing sensory stimulation and supports for when the lights are too bright, lots of sleep and rest, accommodations for communicating and socializing, respecting my routines instead of trying to push myself out of them, and respect for my nervous system limits without shame. All of this, it must be said, is made infinitely easier by the economic and white privilege that I have. There are so many autistics who know what they need to do for themselves and do not have the privilege or flexibility to do it. My joy and massive relief in my autistic identity doesn't erase my struggles, nor am I equating what's hard for me with what's hard for autistics who are more disabled than I am. I am simply celebrating. I know who I am now. I finally have the right Torah for my particular brain and body. It is not an exaggeration to say that discovering I'm autistic has been the single most healing thing to ever happen to me. This is liberation. In closing, on this Inclusion Shabbat, I want to say a word about the word inclusion. The disability justice ancestors on whose shoulders we all stand who care about this issue, they had to start with inclusion because for centuries and still, intellectually disabled people who couldn't speak with their mouths, were quite literally thrown away from society in horrid institutions or worse, excluded from basic needs like their families, safety, education, autonomy, good food, dignity, hygiene, and healthcare. That was the despicable starting point. So the word inclusion is vitally important because all people are in the image of God. All people deserve dignity and to be included in society. Infrastructure that allows physically disabled people to access and be included in spaces, in transit, in workplaces. This is all vitally important. But once we understand this, in the realm of neurodiversity, the word inclusion can become a bit problematic. It can inadvertently bring to mind that there is some kind of normal that divergent or disabled people are being paternalistically welcomed into. Come, let us include you in real normal society. And as you can imagine, I have some feelings about that. See, I have had the privilege of passing as non-autistic my whole life. It's one of the many reasons that nobody figured it out. I've always been welcomed into neurotypical spaces without bias, and it's a privilege I don't take for granted at all. But to tell you the truth, after 41 years of masking my autism and trying to keep up with the pace of neurotypical life, I am tired. Neurotypical spaces often exhaust and overwhelm me, and I feel safer in autistic community and spaces these days. In my home, in my online autistic communities, in the homes of friends who are really making it a safe and warm, comfortable place for me. I want access to what I need to live well, and for the record, I love the term accessibility. But inclusion in what passes for normal isn't really my goal. And I'm not saying it can't be yours. As another example of this, before he burnt out, my son attended an inclusion classroom in the Boston Public Schools. But folks, it was actually just a regular classroom that had a few neurodivergent kids in it. The school didn't change the classroom, the school day, the learning modalities, the schedule to make it a healthy place for neurodivergent brains and bodies, nor did they make any effort for inclusion to go both ways. They never included neurotypical children in autistic modes of play and learning and communicating. Instead, they spent most of their energy trying to get these young autistic kids to conform to their neurotypical school norms. I'm not knocking the idea of inclusion classrooms. I support the concept. But inclusion of neurodivergent people without social transformation around us just puts the burden of change right back on us and our vulnerable nervous systems. For autistics, it can cause shame and very, very real damage. In my son's case, inclusion led to a severe mental health crisis called PDA burnout by the age of 5. In my case, my first real burnout was around the age of 20, but essentially the same thing happened. What if our goal wasn't inclusion, but social transformation? After all, we live in a society sick with speed and transient attention. Our normative culture is trampling all of our nervous systems, not just the nervous systems of me and my neurodivergent kin. It's not serving most of us well at all. So I'd like to try this on this Shabbat in closing. I want to include you, regardless of your personal connection to autism, in the liberatory aspects of my autistic culture. I want to include you, to welcome you into the slower pace of life that most autistic people need. I want to welcome you, include you, in having access to pleasurable sensory experiences, cozy spaces to rest throughout the day, to the courage to say no instead of accepting an invitation that would stress you out. I want to include you in the practice of respecting your brain and body's unique needs and limits as non-negotiable. I want to include you in finding community with other people who share your brain wiring when you thought you were the only one in all the world. I want to include you in the beautiful practice of consensual info dumping, where you ask for permission to share about your passions in a long, delicious monologue to someone you love. I want to include you in the soft textures, gentle lighting, silly singing, deep dive learning, beanbag throwing, therapy swinging, long afternoon snuggling under weighted blankets that are the norm in my autistic home. I want to include you in throwing out the capitalist lie that says you are only worthy if you are productive. I want to include you in the way my particular autistic brain pays exquisite attention to natural beauty, feels the personhood of every plant and animal, dives deep into every passion that comes my way, and teaches it forward. I want to include you in the moment when my son and two other little autistic boys were once bouncing on our couch, all of them shouting the same nonsense word over and over, their joyful eyes looking straight ahead and not at each other, and not one adult interrupted their play to teach them social skills. I want to include you in the moment I told my sweet boy that Mama's autistic too, how his smile lit up the room, how he threw his little arms around me, welcoming me home. In this week's Parsha, Mishpatim, we receive our first long list of laws about how to treat each other as Israelites. As we receive all these details, I'm reminded of the powerful midrash on last week's Parsha that teaches that when God's voice came down from Sinai, it split into 70 different voices, each one reaching each individual Israelite according to their own koach, their own strength. What a beautiful midrash. But let's not stop there. Today, let's imagine that after those voices came down, after the smoke was quieter on Sinai, the people saw the mountain had been in smoke and they were inspired to light their own campfires. In the evenings, after Revelation, they gathered around those fires to interpret the Torah that they had received in different ways, in ways that served the actual well-being of their brains and bodies, given each of their strengths and vulnerabilities. Let's imagine our ancestors received not one Torah we should all be included in, even if it accidentally oppresses us, but rather multiple Torahs that teach us how to live well, given who we truly are. Here's to liberation for all of us. Shabbat Shalom.